but the types of mining-related resources we find out there range from small prospects, where groups of guys were looking for ore, to productive mines, to ore treatment mills, and entire town sites which are extinct. And so what does all this have to do with archaeology? Archaeology is the study of the past, generally speaking, through what we refer to as material culture. It combines social science, hard science, and just what I refer to as accumulated knowledge, just stuff we learn along the way. Mining archaeology is a specialized subset. When looking at mine sites, we draw from archaeological practices, formal training in history, and because mines are what were these specialized industrial facilities, of course we also have to consider the historical engineering, technology, and also geology. And these topics of information provide context for really understanding these places. In contrast to stereotypes about archaeology, the discipline as applied to mining rarely involves formal excavation, which for me is really good because it's hard on the knees and it's dirty. The beauty of our mine sites here in the Rocky Mountains is that most of the materials we want to look at are right on the surface, there for quick and clear documentation and interpretation. The people were not there long enough, and the natural environment was not conducive to the accumulation of depth of stuff that traditional archaeologists like looking at and digging through. You can see I think this is the Kitty Mac mine up on the slide. It's a really typical for the environment that we deal with, where we find these places. There's not a lot of level ground there. Let's take a quick look at mining resources, historic mining resources, these sites I'm kind of hinting around, and how we document them as archaeological places. Let's start with a couple of definitions. Before mining could begin, prospectors first had to find the stuff to mine. They had to find ore. And basically with parties of, as I said, these socially dysfunctional guys would find a little bit of capital and go and basically hit the mountains and wander around until they found a place where they thought, there might be something here. They would look for topographical anomalies, geological formations. They would scrape off the dirt, and they'd look at the rock, and they'd go up. Maybe there's something further down. And then the labor really began. With hand tools, they'd have to drive tunnels into the rock or shafts to try and get an idea about what's down in the rock itself. All this was done with other people's money, and there was no guarantee that they were going to find anything. For every mine that ever produced ore out there, there's probably 150, 200 prospects that failed, and if you think about the amount of labor and money that went into that, it's kind of staggering. So prospects by nature were not productive, they were simple, and also short-lived. A mine itself was a discrete industrial entity that produced crude ore from the ground, and they came in a variety of scales, from small and simple. I'm going to go back a slide. Like this prospect. This is similar to a lot of mines throughout the mountains. Some of the mines that were really productive were gigantic industrial complexes. And there were a bunch like this. This is in Cripple Creek. There were a bunch like this around here in Leadville. Continuing with our definition, each prospect and mine had something called a surface plant, which was the collection of facilities that supported work underground. This mine in particular is a shaft operation, a shaft of being a vertical entry straight down. Shaft operations had to have a hoisting system to winch men and materials out of the ground. So over the shaft we have the tower that's called a head frame. In the building at the lower right, that's a hoist house. That's where the winch was. It's a power source. And there's another building behind it. That's the shop. Pardon me. Blacksmith shop where they maintained tools and manufactured hardware. And on the left, that tall building is an ore house where they stored pay rock between shipments. So this is a pretty typical surface plant. This is the sort of thing we're looking for when we're out dealing with our mine sites. One more site type, one more definition. A mill was another type of resource specific to the mining industry. Most mills, in contrast to misconceptions, did not produce any kind of metals or silver or gold. Their function was purely to separate waste from the good stuff. When mining companies had to send their ore someplace, which usually was a smelter, the smelter charged a heck of a lot of money for the full treatment to produce the metals. And then, of course, the teamster who would freight the ore to the railroad wanted his cut, and the railroad itself charged a lot of money, and the mining company basically saw its profits evaporate. Some companies figured if they did some of this work on their own property, they could save a lot of costs. So these mills produced concentrates, which then were sent. There were some mills in gold places, gold centers like Granite over Clear Creek County that did produce metals. When we assess a historic mine site, we look for these three general categories of manifestations. These things tend to make up most sites. They tell us lots about what happened and what they were doing. And the three categories are archaeological features, engineering features, and architectural features. To take a look at what these are at most historic sites today, architectural features include standing buildings. Buildings at mine sites today tend to be, we consider these very important because they're extremely rare. There are not many of them left. They all fell down or were taken apart. Engineering features include intact machinery, such as I mentioned this hoist winch that was used in conjunction with a shaft. That's what's at center. It was run by steam, and its boiler is off to the right there. And machinery in general among mine sites is exceptionally rare and important as well. There's not a lot of it left either. Another type of engineering feature that we sometimes find at sites are what we call engineered structures. They were built, they were assembled, they're not really buildings, they're not really machinery. In the slide is a head frame which stood over a shaft, guiding the hoisting cable down. This is right across the valley over in the Sugarloaf Mining District. And then we move into the category of archaeological features, which make up nearly all the mine and mill sites that are out there today. When machinery and structural elements were removed from these places, they usually left telltale evidence representing what was at one time there. Archaeological features can include totally collapsed buildings and structures. In the slide is a flattened boarding house at a mine near Breckenridge, as an example. Partially collapsed buildings like this blacksmith shop ruin near Silverton. That's another type of archaeological feature. Machine foundations, yet another category of archaeological feature. These in particular anchored some mill appliance at a mine site near Silver Cliff. And included in this category are other manifestations that never were buildings or machinery, they just were what they were. Like this stockpile of logs that was dragged and deposited near this mine in Breckenridge. They were going to use them, but they never got around to it. And of course, archaeological features include things readily recognizable to traditional archaeologists, which is buried stuff, buried deposits, privy pits. Those are really common. Those are the pits underneath outhouses. One hopes that it's all just soil nowadays, but not always. And there are different types of buried structures, but they're pretty much rare. And one more facet that we pay attention to on these sites as we work them over are artifacts. And by definition, artifacts include everything man-made or everything that was left, everything that was brought to a site and just left. Bits and pieces of industrial junk, cans, broken glass, nails, and lumber, all this kind of stuff. And artifacts are really important because they tell us a lot of what we need to know about what was happening and when. And how we deal with the resources, these mining sites, when we encounter them, is to thoroughly document them to fulfill layered purposes later on. We map all of the site features in detail in a way that captures the essence of the site. We also describe all of the features that I was just going over with text. We record, we inventory all the artifacts that are associated with these things. And when considered together, when we look at all of the stuff as a picture, it really starts to put together what would the life cycle, who was living there, who was developing the property, when were they doing it, what were their working conditions like. So why do we do mining archaeology in general? And as an archaeologist and historian, I would hope that preservation of places in history is enough motivation for our work. But of course, none of us are really that naive, and I understand that there has to be some practical tie-in driving these mining-related projects. And over the years, I found that projects involving old mines are driven by one of three general forces. One is historic preservation. There are in Colorado, there's a good number of local interests, nonprofits, local government entities that understand what they've got, they identify with their history, they think these mine sites are really cool, and they want to preserve them. They don't want to see that past disappear. Another category of project would be heritage tourism. And about 10 years ago, 20 years ago, there were some folks in the state government, some real progressive folks, who did some quantifying and realized that there's a type of tourist who comes to Colorado. They're now called heritage tourists, heritage tourism. These people, they come from out of state, and they bring, I think it's tens and tens, if not a couple $100 million of new money from elsewhere into Colorado every year. That's a lot of money. And these progressive interests realize that, gosh, these people need something to come and see. And if it all rots and falls away and disappears and becomes overgrown, they're not going to come here anymore. So there are a lot of projects, and I mean, Colorado, it's known for mining. That's one of our brands, if we can use that term. But by far the most common reason why we document these old mine sites is, here we go with a term, oh God, cultural resource compliance. It is a requirement for a dozen different categories of land use projects, and it's also pretty well funded. I won't go into wonky details, but I'm assuming maybe there's 2 or 3 people who know what I'm talking about. How many people know what the NEPA process is for? All right. It requires, cultural resource compliance is the counterpart, but it requires, when there's a project involving federal land or federal money, it requires the cultural resources, that would be all the historic sites and prehistoric sites, it requires the impacts to those be considered and weighed. We need to know what we're dealing with in terms of site types, whether they're really good or whether they're junk and can be bulldozed. So, as I said, cultural resource compliance drives by far most of the projects involving historic mines, and those people who do know what it is, they don't like thinking about it because it sounds dreadful, heavy, and scary. Just the title, I can see your eyes glazing over out there now. Oh, it's so boring. Oh, God, what a horrible thing. Cultural resource compliance, it's going to be expensive and slow and get in the way. But really, it's not so onerous if the project is well organized. And it really, this compliance is really the only opportunity a lot of the historic mine sites that are out there all around us it's the only opportunity they'll ever have to be recognized and documented in any kind of way. A misconception that I've heard, there has never been and is no central program to document historic mine sites in any place in Colorado. It just happens on a project-by-project basis. So these projects are really it for these sites. So when we do our historic site assessments, the products that we produce can be applicable to all 3 of those project generators that I mentioned a second ago. There was a huge cleanup on the east side of town, maybe about, 7, 8 years back, where they achieved the cleanup that they wanted to. Well, that's debatable. But they also did a lot of heritage tourism and historic preservation. A lot of those sites are still there because they planned it well. That's an example of what we can do. And there's one more goal that's common to all of the projects that we work on. It's not required, but we ought to take the few extra steps to draw meaning from these historic sites using the information that we gather. The question I often hear today is, don't today's archival sources in popular literature tell us a lot of what we want to know about mining history, Leadville, what the miners were doing, and that sort of thing? And the answer is sort of, but not really, because archival sources, they reflect what the records keepers of the past thought were important at the time. And these guys left out a lot of stuff that is really interesting, but they thought was either boring at the time or they thought was taboo. No, we can't talk about the level of alcoholism, or we can't. I mean, what did people eat back then? That was boring to them. But I find it really interesting because they didn't have convenience foods and ho-hos and these other things. Also, popular literature focuses on glamour, romance, and exceptional people telling only part of the story. And so archaeology, with the information that we gather, it can tell us a lot about what really happened on the frontier, a lot about average people, how they really lived, their adventures, and of course the technical side of what they were doing. For a lot of people, I know that's boring. I find it interesting, but and what I can do, if I have time, is to go over just a couple of myths that we've been able to bust with historic archaeology. in the mountains. One myth is that the mining frontier was a man's world and that the only women present were prostitutes, and that there were lots of those, but not many of family women, I guess. What we actually find is that women and families were universal on the mining frontier. Women didn't receive a lot of documentation because it was boring. The records keepers were men. Women were everywhere, and I found evidence of them and of children in the most ungodly places throughout the mountains. Another myth is that miners subsisted on liquor and tobacco, and that they would get drunk and shoot up the town. And in reality, most miners didn't live in town because they had to walk too far to work. So they lived at the mines. And in reality, according to what we see out there in the field, is that they drank about as much liquor as we do today, maybe a bit more. Several reasons explain this. One is that Victorian culture of the era frowned on people getting drunk. Another one is that they were on company premises. Company housing, let's try that. And some mining companies didn't like it. People could get paid only as long as they could work, and if you're drunk or hungover, you couldn't work very well. So they had an incentive to not get drunk. Co-workers, mining was dangerous. I sure wouldn't want my co-workers showing up drunk or being hungover. So there were a lot of incentives to not drink, just like with today. The last myth that I'll go over is that the common mining frontier diet is beans. Weren't there some beans out there on the table? And some sort of pork product, preserved pork product, and flapjacks. And that's what people think that everybody ate on the frontier. And it's not so. The common diet was surprisingly diverse. And that yesteryear, cans were today's equivalent of convenience foods. They didn't have an AM/PM market that they could go to. They didn't have freezers and these sorts of things. So there were all kinds of food came in cans: soup, stew, vegetables. But these were relied on only when people were really far away, camping out in remote places. People of the era really wanted fresh food. They wanted fresh meat, vegetables, fruit, a lot of baked goods, a lot of fat, heaviness. They burned a tremendous amount of calories. And so out there we see a lot of evidence of fresh food. Steaks, ribs, beef stew, roasts. Up in the slide is a little picture of a institutional-sized cook stove where they were baking a lot of stuff at a mining camp in the Central Mountains. And I think it's about time. So, in conclusion, I would like to say that the mining archaeology I've been describing thus far is not a rarely practiced academic endeavor, and it is instead fostered by projects, watershed projects in particular in this area, involving abandoned mines. And cultural resource compliance, that dreadful term, such as what's going on in the watershed right around here, is critical to forwarding the field and to us developing a greater understanding of our heritage. That's it. Thanks.